evening. I'm Bria Tchaikovsky-Louis, and from wherever you may be joining us, I'd like to warmly welcome you to today's program featuring Yossi, Klein, Halevi. I want to thank Rachel Cohen for all of the help you've given us in organizing this event and for your support today. Seattle Friends of Roots was founded 3 years ago with a wonderful visit to Seattle by Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger and Shadi Abu Awad. Seattle Friends of Roots is part of a worldwide network of supporters of Roots, Shorashim, Judur. But we claim a special connection to Roots because Rabbi Shaul Yudelman, one of the founders of Roots, one of the leaders currently of Roots, grew up here in Seattle, attending Seattle Jewish Academy and Garfield High School. I'll put our email information on the chat and encourage you to be in touch with anything that comes up for you as a result of today. Please feel free to contact us. It is my honor and my great joy to introduce you to Rabbi Shaul Yudelman.
Thank you, Bria. It's great to be here in many ways. As an excellent Seattleite, it's also an honor to be on this call and connecting worlds for me. Israeli-Palestinian work through Roots has really become my full-time dedication over the last 8 years. It's my own personal Jewish journey that really started here in Seattle with the Seattle Hebrew Academy, Beth Shalom, and more. And for me, Roots has been a real place to powerfully engage with reality. I'd quote something I remember hearing in Seattle a lot back in the 90s. It was, think globally, act locally. And part of Roots' theory of change is with this gigantic thing called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which involves factors from Tehran to the White House to hundreds of years of conflict to religion and all different factors. It sometimes seems a little bit intimidating to do anything. And but Roots thinks that by working locally between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground and addressing issues there to the best we can, and building those connections and discourse, we can also face up to the larger issues at stake in our conflict and reflect on them and build towards them. So also a thank you to Bria, Seattle Friends of Roots, and all the sponsoring synagogues here and everybody on the call. I guess who's not watching the Seahawks right now. That's what Roots has become for me, really a passion in everyday life. And on this journey, there's been many people who have been part of the journey, and it's really an honor to thank and also introduce to who's a real Rebbe, a Rebbe for me, a real role model, Rebbe inspiration, Yossi Klein Halevi. Formerly, Yossi is a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute, and I really recommend hearing his reflections on modern Jewish issues on the podcast there. You can find it through the Hartman website, and we'll post it here. He's worked for years as a journalist, sharing his insights and perspectives from the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. He's also a contributing editor in the New Republic. And for me, it's his books. Yossi's books, his writing, parallel in a deep way the things that Roots works on. Even from his first book, the Reflections of a Jewish Extremist, about a Jewish extremism, something, of course, we're still grappling with in our communities and thinking about and wondering about the places in our collective past that comes from, what it means today. At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden was a book I read, also just as Yossi started to disown the book, so to speak, in the Second Intifada, but held up this hope for something different, something else that could happen in the Holy Land. Meetings between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and their communities across Israel and Palestine. And then, Like Dreamers was a book following 1967 and the '67 war, and the liberation or conquest of Judea Samaria and what that meant, and what that's meant, and how that's developed within Israeli society since then, which I think is also a really great way to catch up on what's happened in Israel the last 50 years. And then the book we're here to hear about today, the Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which I've heard Yossi talk about, is just looking off of his porch. And I'd say it from this way: the Jewish story in Israel is, and what Israel means in the Jewish story, from Judaism and religion and state, and what it means, secular religious meetings and left and right, and the Jewish returning from exile and the process of Israel, is an incredibly powerful story. It's a dream come to life. It can encapsulate and take up all of our time. And it's be very easy to live in our land, caught up in our own story, and disengage from the Palestinian story. But I think that process of that book is very much parallels the process of roots, of coming from within our own people's story, the roots of Jewish or Palestinian life, and recognizing our need to address our neighbors, our co-inhabitants, our enemies, all these things that is Israel-Palestine with each other today. I remember after Yossi published Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor, we invited him to come and speak at Roots. And it was a very powerful event. One of the powerful things we get to see happen over and over at Roots is you have 50 plus Israelis and Palestinians reflecting on the book, on the process of telling each other's story. And really, again, it was the sense that this is a conversation we should have been having 70, 50, 30, 20 years ago. So thank you, Yossi, for coming to share with us. And I know one of the things we respect in this culture is to be able to disagree and not necessarily have to agree with every single point or every single, but the importance to engage, face up to reality, and bring ourselves there. It's going to pass over. We have, I think, about 20 minutes with Yossi, and then some time for questions and answers. And then the program will continue with Rav Hanan Schlesinger and Noor Awad, two core Roots activists, sharing and talking about Roots work, and then also more time for questions and answers. So I'm going to pass myself to the mute button and get ready to enjoy and engage and learn. So thank you, Yossi.
Shalom, thank you. Thank you. And Hanan and Bria, thank you as well for really the extraordinary work that Roots does, for your courage and your open heart and your vision. And, you know, for me, Roots is really a home. It was one of the first places that I brought letters to my Palestinian neighbor to. It was the conversation that I was in some ways most looking forward to. And what I love about Roots is how counterintuitive the whole project is. And it's precisely from these unexpected outbreaks that I believe the breakthroughs will happen in this conflict. It's not going to come from the predictable places. We know those roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, and we actually need Jews, Palestinians who are rooted in their story, who love their story, who fully own it, and yet have the open heart and the open mind, the curiosity to listen to the narrative of the other. And that really, in some ways, was the premise of the book that I published 3 years ago, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And the book is a series of letters to an imaginary Palestinian on the next hill from where I'm sitting now. I live in literally the last row of houses in Jerusalem, the French Hill neighborhood. And on the next hill are 2 Palestinian villages. I'm looking out at the night lights across the way. And the book is a series of letters written to an anonymous Palestinian about who the Jewish people is, who we are as a people, why we came back home, why we believe this is home, a home that we share with another people. The book was translated into Arabic and placed online in Arabic for free downloading. And something like 5,000 people downloaded the Arabic edition. And I invited readers, Palestinians and others in the Middle East, to respond. And I set up a website and created a group of young people from around the Middle East, Iraq, Morocco, Jordan, and of course, Israelis and Palestinians as well, to reach out in various Arabic social media outlets and invite Palestinians to not only read, but to respond. And the book was published in paperback edition 2 years ago with a new 50-page epilogue of responses from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. And the reason that I've structured the book in this way as a conversation over narratives is because I believe that in the end, this is a conflict over narratives, over intangibles. And the diplomats and the politicians speak about tangible issues. They speak about a line on a map. They speak about settlements and holy places and refugees. And those are all obviously crucial issues, but they are not the root of the conflict. They are the consequences of the conflict. The root of this conflict are not those tangible issues, but the intangibles of identity, of history, memory, trauma, belonging, the sense of the right to define myself as a people in this land, the right to sovereignty. Those are the intangibles that I believe form the heart of this conflict. And if we ever get to the point, God willing, where we are negotiating a final status agreement, I believe that we're going to need around the table not only the diplomats this time, but we're going to need rabbis and imams, poets, writers, psychologists, theologians, and a good sprinkling of roots activists, because that's the wisdom that we're going to need in order to really make that conceptual breakthrough from a focus on the tangible issues to the far more difficult and also far more promising area of dealing with the intangibles. And I decided to reach out to Palestinians and tell an Israeli narrative, a Zionist narrative, to what is the most difficult audience for such a story. These are the people who have suffered because of my return home. I don't believe that that was the intention of Zionism, but that was certainly one of the outcomes. And it seemed to me that after 100 years of conflict, the time had come for someone on our side to try to tell our story, not to try to convince Palestinians of our story, but to help Palestinians understand that we have a story. Because most Palestinians, and this is true for, in my experience, for most Arabs and Muslims that I've met over the years, their understanding of who we are as a people is that we're not a people. We are a religion, just as Islam and Christianity are only religions, so too we are only a religion. And so this book tries to unpack the multidimensional facets of Jewish identity. What does it mean to simultaneously be a religion, a people, a global people, a carrier of a 4,000-year history, a multi-ethnic people, a people centered in a land with a diaspora? These are the elements of Jewish identity, contemporary Jewish identity, that I felt the urgent need to try to explain to my neighbors, and inviting my neighbors to explain their story to me, because this was not envisioned as a one-way lecture, but as a conversation. And as I mentioned before, the paperback edition contains an extensive epilogue of Palestinian responses. And I made the decision, which was not an easy decision, to end the book with the Palestinian letters. In other words, a book that I had written to defend the Zionist narrative ends with the counter narrative. And initially I thought that perhaps I'll write responses to each of these letters, because there's so much in the Palestinian responses that I deeply disagree with. And then I felt, if I'm serious about trying to create a new kind of conversation about narrative, not a debate, but a painful experience of mutual listening, then I needed to signal to my Palestinian neighbors that I'm serious. And so I gave them the last word in my own book, And there's something that's deeply counterintuitive in that gesture, not only in the context of this conflict, but really, I think, in the context of how political disagreements are navigated these days, generally, almost everywhere. In your society, it's still astonishing to me that Democrats and Republicans, when I was growing up, Democrats and Republicans were kind of variations of more or less the same theme. You certainly would never think of them as enemies. And yet today, Democrats and Republicans increasingly see each other as almost existential threats. And so I was hoping that this book could not only be useful for helping Palestinians and Israelis speak about our conflicting and probably irreconcilable narratives, but also help people in other conflicts create a language or a sensibility of how to speak about differences. Now, I wrote this book really for two reasons. The first is to create a model for how Palestinians and Israelis could respectfully disagree with each other, could speak about the most painful issues, the most deeply personal issues. And what you need to understand about this conflict is that this is not about politics. This is about our lives. This is about our deepest identity for both peoples. There's nothing impersonal. There's nothing abstract for either people about this conflict. And so how do we speak about these deepest issues of pain around the same table? And this is something that Roots does as a matter of course. This is actually the essence of what Roots is. And what my job as a writer really was to try to create a language for what that process might sound like. So that was one purpose. The second purpose, which for me was really no less important, was to defend the Zionist story, which, as we all know, is under increasing and systematic assault. The basic legitimacy of the Jewish return home is under assault. And I felt an acute need to tell that story as I understand it, as I love that story, with all of its complications, why I tied my life to this story. And so that's what I wanted my neighbor to understand. And I certainly was hoping that others, American Jews, for example, would eavesdrop on my conversation with my neighbors and find this book useful. The criticism that the book received, legitimate and understandable criticism, was that how can you, as the conqueror, as the all-powerful Israeli, expect your Palestinian neighbor to be interested in your narrative? On what grounds do you come to your neighbor and pretend that you're both on equal footing when I have my boot on his neck? And the power differential obviously is key to this relationship. But I would argue that when you see the dynamic through Israeli eyes, it starts to look a little more complicated. If you only look at the conflict as Palestinians versus Israelis, then yes, we are Goliath and the Palestinians are David. But if you widen the lens to include not just the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but the Arab-Israeli conflict, or even more broadly, a Muslim-Israeli conflict, factoring in Iran and other hostile Muslim countries that complicate Israel's diplomatic standing, for example, around the world, then the balance of power begins to look a little differently. And Israelis have a kind of a split screen in our heads when we see this conflict. One side of the screen is Israel versus the Palestinians, and there again, we hold overwhelming power. The other side of the screen, Israel versus the region. And there, the balance of power looks very different. Now, it's true that the region is changing. Parts of the region are becoming more receptive to Israel's presence. So this is potentially a very important moment that I believe could have long-term significance for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But as we've experienced this conflict for the better part of the last 70 years, we have simultaneously been powerful against the Palestinians and embattled against the region. And so the asymmetry of power has only a limited resonance for Israelis, because in another way, we feel that the imbalance of power works against us. And the final point here that I think is really important to understand is that since the Second Intifada, most Israeli Jews do not feel guilty any longer about the occupation. Even those many Israeli Jews who once did feel guilty about the occupation no longer do. And the reason for that is very straightforward. Most Israelis deeply believe that we tried in good faith to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, first under the at Camp David, and then with the Clinton proposals in December 2000. And the Palestinian pattern of rejecting one peace offer after another made a two-state solution impossible. So whether you agree with that narrative or not, what's important to understand is that most Israelis deeply believe that. And for that reason, when you come to Israelis and say, well, you hold all the power and the Palestinians don't, the normative Israeli response is, well, if Palestinians want to end the occupation, then let their leadership come up with a credible peace offer, because we're done reaching out. And that's where most Israelis are today. And so this book is also an attempt to try to break that impasse. The book, by the way, has just come out in Hebrew. And Shaul and Hanan, maybe there's something we can do now that it's available in both Hebrew and Arabic. I'm wondering if there's something, parenthetically, some way of trying to reach Israelis now with this book. So that's something we can speak about off camera. How much time left? Hanan?
We have 15 minutes, including in time for questions.
So I can go for another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm very often asked, what did I learn in this process? And I have to tell you, in all honesty, I've been involved, I've lived this conflict as an Israeli for 40 years. I made Aliyah in the summer of 1982. This is, God willing, this summer will be my 40th anniversary as an Israeli. I've worked as a journalist. I've been a soldier. I've tried to work in reconciliation. So I've experienced this conflict from many different perspectives. And so it's when you've been involved in this conflict that long, from a professional perspective, when you've lived the conflict professionally, it's very hard to learn new facts that will fundamentally alter the way you see the conflict. Yes, of course, you're always learning new details, but your basic worldview has long since been shaped. What did change me in this in this process were not my ideas, but my being. Because like most Israelis, after the Second Intifada, and Shaul made oblique reference to that in his introduction, after the Second Intifada, those 4 terrible years of suicide bombings, like most Israelis, I shut myself off from the Palestinians. I literally and metaphorically walled myself off. And I use that metaphor because outside my porch is the wall, the security wall. And so that wall really became a kind of a personal metaphor for me. I no longer wanted anything to do with the Palestinians. I didn't want to see what was happening on the next hill. And like most Israelis, my response was, if you want a Palestinian state, then stop rejecting our peace offers, or at least negotiate in good faith, or at least come up with an offer that we on the Israeli side can live with, which means no right of return to the state of Israel, for example. And so I turned away. And it was only gradually that I began to teach myself to see again. And this book was really an experiment in trying to force myself to open myself up again to this conflict, which really will pursue us whether we try to avoid it or not. And so, first of all, this book was really an attempt. It was speaking to myself. And then I put this book out and hoped it would resonate among some of my neighbors, and it has. And finally, I hoped it would resonate in the wider world, and especially in the American Jewish community. And I've been deeply moved by the reception that the book has received, especially among young American Jews, who I think are looking for a language, a sensibility that can combine rootedness in the Jewish story, in our people's narrative, along with an openness and an empathy to the Palestinian narrative. And that's really what I tried to model in this book, a dual language, a language of love and pride in the Jewish and Zionist story, and a deep awareness, or an attempt to create a deepening awareness of the Palestinian tragedy, and how those two sensibilities, those two languages, are not necessarily in conflict, but really could be complementary. So why don't we open for conversation now?
Great, thank you, Yossi, for walking the narrow bridge. If people want to either raise their hands with the Zoom function or write questions in the comment in the chat box, feel free either way, and we'll try to hear as much as we can. Also, feel free to unmute yourself and make a statement. Actually, right now, I think that's maybe it's hard to see the whole entire screen here.
Can I ask a question?
Please, Michael. Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you very much, Yossi. This was incredibly interesting and helpful. I just finished about 2 weeks ago reading this most recent edition of your book, and was very, very moved. I will say that epilogue was very hard to read, as that final word. It was tough. My question to you is sort of what's next? You've put out, your olive branch. You've allowed the responses to come back. Do you have something next planned on that?
It's a really good question. I set up a website, letterstomyneighbor.com, and there are a number of projects there. First of all, there are lots of letters from all around the Middle East that appear on the website, both in Arabic and in English. The website exists in both those languages. And there are also a number of films that you'll find if you go into the video section. And the films really were an attempt to take this and project it outward. And the truth is that in the last year, I've become involved with a new book project. And with Corona, I've really been basically in self-lockdown, sitting in a room and writing. I would like to take this back out. I think that for me, the next step is to take this into the Israeli public and see whether this book has any resonance for Israelis. I'm a little wary of how this is going to be received. And the book has been out now in Hebrew for about 2 months, 3 months. And so far there's been almost no reaction. I'm going to keep trying. And I feel that that's in some ways the missing piece of this process. I would like to challenge Israelis with what I feel can be useful in an Israeli context with this book, is that this book is creating a language for peace that's not left-wing and not secular. And again, it brings me very much in harmony with Roots. Roots are the people that in some ways I feel closest to. Whether we agree or disagree on all the nuances, as Shaul said, is secondary to the fact that we share a sensibility. And that's much more important than the details of how we see resolving this conflict. And so I really want to bring that sensibility, a religious voice for reconciliation that stands firmly in a love for the land of Israel, that sees all of the land of Israel from the river to the sea, to quote a phrase, from the river to the sea, in principle, it's all mine, but there's another people there that I have to come to terms with, but that doesn't negate the fact that in principle, this land is all mine, just as Palestinians believe that the whole land is theirs. And I understand that because I feel the same way. And so it's a different language for speaking about peace. I see this very much as a language that could be useful for the political center in Israel. And I think it's important, and there's one last comment I'll make before opening for the next question, but I think it's really important for American Jews to understand that the political divide in Israel is no longer between right and left. The left is virtually insignificant here. The real divide is between the right and the center. And this is a book that comes out of the center. And I believe, Shaul and Hanan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I very much place Roots in the broad context of an Israeli center.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yossi. I want to move on I agree, and there's definitely what to talk about, some ideas too. I saw that similar question in a similar vein, but let's go to the changes feasible in the short and likely feasible terms in the short and likely short term. And I'll ask the next question too, if you want to, as relate to that shortly, and then also how proponents of BDS responded to the book. What does Yossi and what does Roots think of BDS, which seem to kind of discourage these kinds of conversations on the grounds that it normalizes relations and normalizes occupation?
Well, that's easy. I'll answer that one first. I find BDS to be morally, politically, rationally offensive and outrageous. I find BDS to be one of the great threats facing the Jewish people in the diaspora, not Israel. I don't believe that BDS is a real threat to Israel. BDS has made no appreciable impact on the Israeli economy. The Israeli economy is thriving. BDS is a total failure in that respect. But BDS has had a tremendous impact on campuses, on putting American Jews on the defensive in progressive spaces, on making American Jews feel again like they don't quite belong. And that's something that American Jews have not felt in America for a long time. And that's what BDS is doing. And so I see BDS ultimately as not about Israel at all, but I see it very much as a threat to American Jewry. Other questions? I'm sorry, what were the two other questions, Shaul?
A question about changes that you see feasible in the short term. Meaning...
Micha Goodman, the Israeli philosopher and writer, has been working on this question He wrote a very important piece in The Atlantic, which I recommend, called Managing the Conflict. And by managing the conflict, he did not mean maintaining the status quo, but really going deeply into the pathologies of the occupation and how to substantially make life better for the Palestinians in this interim period, and I would probably say prolonged interim period, before we're going to be anywhere near ready to negotiate an agreement, if we ever get there at all, quite honestly. So I think that we can't keep delaying the questions of daily life for Palestinians. This is something that should be, in principle at least, a nonpartisan Israeli issue. This should be an issue that is of self-interest to Israelis. Because if my neighbor has a better life, then chances are I'll probably sleep a little bit better. And so just on the basis of self-interest alone, leaving aside the weighty moral issues for a moment, this is really a pressing issue. So without going into details, I think this should really be on the agenda. And it's something that in principle, this of all governments should be doing. This is the perfect government to be taking those kinds of non-final status daily life issues. What was the next question, Sean?
That's a great segue to the next question, actually. I mean, especially speaking as you see the book as something, a platform that could be seen by the centrist, a book out of the center of Israel. The question is, do you have a feeling whether the new Israeli co-prime ministers might be more receptive to your ideas book? And the question of, I think, how do these ideas enter the mainstream? How do they get adopted? Is a media plan for the book to get Israelis in the political arena's attention?
Yeah, I sent it to Yair Lapid, and I got word that he was reading. And I have a feeling that Bennett is probably busy these days. But I would like to try to get it to him as well. And I have a list, I am trying to send it to various journalists and opinion makers. I see this really as a long-term project. I don't see this book as making a big splash in Israel, simply because people are so tired of this topic. People really don't want to read a book about an Israeli reaching out to Palestinians. Most Israelis are not interested in this. But I'm looking for a few people who are, and hopefully people who are in positions of either political or cultural influence, who might be able to get this message across. But again, I see it as a long-term process.
In the responses, have you found respected Palestinian supporters or leaders who you feel assisting or in the same boat?
Among Palestinian leaders?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I was invited to go to the Mukata, to go to
the Palestinian leadership, the PLO's leadership, right?
Abbas's headquarters in Ramallah. And there was going to be a meeting, and then 2 days before the meeting, it was abruptly canceled. And I wasn't surprised, and I wasn't particularly upset about it. I was going because I was invited, and it was really just a question of fulfilling an obligation. I have no expectations of this generation of Palestinian leaders, just as I have no expectations of this generation of Israeli leaders, quite frankly.
So I know I want to respect your time. It is 8:40 right now. There's another good question here. Can we close with this one?
Let's take the question.
So, Tamara wrote, I'm also curious if you've read Hartman's essay, Liberal Zionism and the Troubled Committed, in sources, and Shaul Magid's response to his article, which is Zionism no longer able to offer solutions to the present reality.
I read Danielle's piece. I thought it was a very important contribution. I started reading Shaul's piece and stopped. just one word about Jewish anti-Zionism, which is that Jewish anti-Zionism claims to be a realistic critique of the failure of Zionism, and yet it totally ignores what the reality of the Jewish people would look like if the anti-Zionist vision were implemented. I don't believe that the Jewish people as we know it would survive the dismantling of the state of Israel. And so I can't take the Jewish anti-Zionist critique seriously. I consider it to be intellectually and spiritually bankrupt. And I will not engage, quite honestly, with Jewish anti-Zionists over the terms and conditions of my self-destruction. It's not part of my conversation. I'm willing and eager to have conversations with all kinds of people with whom I disagree. I will have conversations with Palestinians who believe that Israel should be destroyed. That's fair. I will have conversations with Hamas. I don't care. You're my enemy, and we're trying to figure out how to get past this conflict. I will speak to any Palestinian that will speak to me, but I will not engage with fellow Jews who see the destruction of the state of Israel as a moral imperative. That has no interest for me. So that's my response to Shaul. Not interested. And he is an old friend. So there is personal friendship, and there's and I am Shaul's friend, and I love Shaul, and we go back 40, 50 years probably. And we have a history, as they say. But he's not my partner for engagement publicly.
Important to understand red lines in terms in the work.
Yeah, my other red line on the other side, and the Roots guys will appreciate this. My other red line are the Kahanists. The Jews who advocate murder in the name of Torah. They're not my conversation partners either. But between those two red lines, there's a very wide spectrum of people that I happily engage with.
Yossi, I want to draw a mild line in the presentation today and to say thank you so much for joining us. And I know there's many more questions coming up now, so I invite people to follow on Yossi's podcast. He's also very good at responding on Facebook, and there's always ways to get in touch. I put up some links there for some of the sources that he related to.
Really a pleasure. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in Roots, and whatever you can do to help would be deeply appreciated. If there's any hope at all out there, these are the guys who are carrying it. So thank you for everything you do, and Chazak v'yamatz, Shaul, Hanan. Take care, everyone, and pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi. Self-care. Thank you so much. So everyone takes a deep breath, a moment to stand up, and it's also now my deep pleasure to as MC here to introduce two of my deep partners here, to my great teachers and co-workers, Rav Hanan Schlesinger and Noor Awad, two people involved in the core of moving Roots and managing and moving. And Hanan is the director of international relations. She just came back from a speaking tour with Shadi Abu Awad in North America, and has been involved in Roots since basically day one. And Noor Awad, who journeyed to Roots, and I'm sure he'll share part of his story, how he got to Roots about 4.5 years ago, and has been one of my greatest teachers and sources of information and inspiration, and walking this path together. And Hanan's joining us, I think, from, that looks like his office in Alon Shut, and Noor from his home in Bethlehem. So I'm going to be quiet again and pass over to Hanan and Noor. And again, at the end, we'll have time for questions. If people want to write questions during the presentation, and also definitely post an email address there so that people can follow up if we don't get time to everything, which is generally the case. So thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. I'd like to begin even though Yossi Klein Halevi is no longer with us, by thanking him, I have to say that during a good part of Yossi's presentation, I literally had tears in my eyes. It was so gratifying and so ratifying to hear someone who's not involved in the daily work of Roots to express our values and the conclusions we've come to from our 8 years of work in language so similar to the language that we use. I really felt that Yossi, our teacher and our rabbi, was giving a stamp of approval to the deepest insights and experiences and conclusions that we in Roots have come to over these 8 years. So thank you, Yossi, and I'm saying to everyone that 90% of what he said is what Roots is. Okay, so with that introduction, I would like to talk at the outset about what I call a holy place. Roots has established what we call, among other terms, the Dignity Center. We have the only, literally the only joint Israeli-Palestinian community center in the whole area that's termed the West Bank by internationals, termed Judah and Samaria by many of us local Jews, and Palestine, or the West Bank of Palestine, by Palestinians. In that little strip of land, there's only one space, only one place where Israeli Jews and Palestinians can come and do come together to meet each other and engage with each other as equals with dignity. There's no other place like it, and for me it's a holy place for that reason. I want to explain a little bit what I mean there's no other place like it. You see that in that area, that again I'm calling Judean Samaria / West Bank / Palestine, Israeli Jews and Palestinians live. They live in a certain sense together, that they're in the same landmass, the same small geographical piece of land, but while we're so close together geographically, we're so far apart. We live in separate towns and villages, different languages, different cultures. We have different school systems, different transportation systems. We have different governments, local and national. We have different health systems. Everything is separate. Different calendars, when people go to work, when they're off, when the kids are in school. Everything is separate. And there's no common ground. When I say no common ground, I mean literally there's no place, because Israelis are forbidden by Israeli military law from entering Palestinian areas of residence. And Palestinians are forbidden by Israeli military law from usually entering Israeli places, towns, cities in the West Bank / Judean Samaria. So had there been a crazy Israeli or crazy Palestinian who wanted to have a cup of coffee together, there's literally no place to do it. Just about no place to do it, to sit together with dignity, with a sense of equality and mutual security. There's no place the two sides can sit together except in the Dignity Center that we in Roots created about 8 years ago. And that for me makes it a holy ground. It's where the two sides can and do meet to discover a human being on the other side of the fence. And not just a human being, but the bearer of a very, very particular national identity. So how do we do that? How do we bring the two sides together? First, just creating the space is a big part of it. And then through our activities, both facilitated and unfacilitated, whether it's open houses, whether it's lectures, whether it's language classes, whether it's summer camps, day camps, photography workshops, music therapy, interfaith dialogue, through all these activities that are happening almost every day, the two sides meet each other, discover human beings, surprised. They're surprised that they're surprised, but they're still surprised that I can actually talk to the other side. We have something in common, that he's pretty much or she's pretty much like us. And from my perspective, people begin to undergo a process of healing. What do I mean healing? I mean that usually the two sides don't see each other. We don't recognize that they exist. All we have for them is stereotypes and bigotry and something similar to racism, misunderstandings, lots of fear and resentment. We're blind to who they are on both sides. And then we begin to realize that they're really here. They're significant. They're human. We have to take them into account. And we begin to hear their story of who they are. And they begin to hear our story of who we are. And the two stories are so different. We don't know who they are. They don't know who we are. And we don't know who they are. We don't know who we are in their eyes. And we don't know who they are in their eyes. We begin to wake up to the existence of a whole nother reality that's right in front of our faces, but we never saw. The process of healing means that we move from a place of the hubris of exclusivity to an expanded consciousness, from that place in which we only know our own side, our own people, our own narrative, which we begin to realize they exist as well. We expand our sense of what's true, our sense of what's significant in this land, of who belongs in this land, without, of course, giving up our own sense of belonging to this land. That's a process of expansion, a process of, I think, spiritual maturity. It's a process of healing, and all this takes place in the activities of Roots in the Dignity Center. That's really, really significant for me. It's a miracle. It's holy. It means that we've established something like a mental health clinic for bringing healing to the land. I want to talk a little bit about the unique methodology and insights of Roots. We've discovered that Israelis and Palestinians both usually go to sleep at night dreaming the other side will disappear. Because we know, in quotes, that they don't belong. And then you begin to talk to them, again on both sides and both directions, and you realize the Palestinians belong just like we Israeli Jews belong. And the Palestinians realize that the Jews belong just like they belong, that we both belong to the same land and neither side is going anywhere. To come to that realization is a real shock. It's a real shock that you have to conclude the other side belongs there just like I belong there. I remember that once Ali Abu Awad, one of the Palestinian founders, said to us, it looks like we have to fit two truths into one heart and two peoples into one land. That's really what it's about. Two truths into one heart and two peoples into one land. Because you see, most Palestinians, and Yossi talked about this, build their identity upon the nullification of the Jewish Zionist Israeli identity. And most Israeli Jews build their identity upon the nullification of the other side, the Palestinian identity. You see, most Palestinians say, Jews, great, a wonderful religion, but it's a religion, not a people. You don't need land, you're only a faith. You can practice wherever in the world. Why did you come to take our land, they say to us. And we Israelis say to the Palestinians, Palestinian? No, there's no such thing. There never was a Palestinian state. There's no Palestinian people. You're just Arabs. So go back to Saudi Arabia where you came from. Go back to Jordan. And each side thinks they can tell the other side who they are. And we've learned in Roots you can never tell the other side who they are. You have to listen when they tell who they are. And then they will listen when you tell who you are. And it turns out that there's Palestinians, they're a people, they're a unique group, and they belong to the land. And it turns out there's Israeli Jews around the world who belong to that same land. And like Yossi said, it's the same land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It's all Palestine. Excuse me if I offended someone. And it's all Israel. Excuse me if I offended someone. I just offended everyone. And in the hearts and the souls of Roots activists, we're putting together those two truths that both sides belong, and the whole land is Israel and the whole land is Palestine. And again, like Yossi said, we think this is the core, the foundation for a future peace settlement, about recognition of the other side's identity narrative. Because this conflict, as Yossi said, the politics of it is so important, but it's a consequence of something deeper. The roots are who are we and who are they. We have to recognize that just as we and our identity is true and belongs to the land, so their identity is true and they belong in the land also. I want to add I think just about one more point,
Samuel, if there is something that you think I should
which is the following. Roots began and stays centered in Judean Samaria / Palestine / the West Bank for a reason. It's not just that Shaul and I and the activists happen to live there. We're in the West Bank, in Judean Samaria, because that's the heart of the conflict. That's where the Jewish people were born. That's where we have our history. That's our heartbeat. And by and large, the Jews who live in Judean Samaria are the people most connected to their historical identity, most wedded to our narrative and our truth and our connection to the land. What you would call the right wing, what you would call perhaps the extremists, the extreme settlers, the extreme nationalists, that's us. And on the Palestinian side, many of the members and activists and roots are Palestinians who you would consider to be right-wing, who are deeply connected to their national narrative, whether we're talking about Palestinian nationalists, whether we're talking about religious Muslims, observant Muslims, whether we're talking about refugee families who lost everything in 1948, whether we're talking about Palestinians who've been in Israeli jail or have relatives in Israeli jail. In other words, we're bringing together the two poles, the people who you'd think have nothing to talk about, who are just enemies, and we're realizing that we do have a common language. The language of religious faith unites us. The language of connection to land unites us. The language of nationalism, of being wedded and being in love with our own particular identities, that's what unites us. And so we're creating a new language for peace. Yossi called it the center. I would call it the extreme left and the extreme right. We're both at the same time. We're the extreme right because we're so wedded to the land and to our identities and our particular history. We're the extreme left because we are completely legitimizing the other side's identity as well. So if the extreme right and extreme left creates the center, then accept Yossi's formulation that we're in the center. So this is a new formula for peace, one that is not about erasing national identity and religious identity, one that's not about just creating a universalistic language that we're all human beings, but really a particularistic language wedded to our particularism that nevertheless opens its heart and its mind to the legitimacy of the other side and the fullness of their identity. So this is a new opening, I would say, for a better future in this land. It's through that mutual recognition of identity that we are establishing the human groundwork that will serve as the basis for a political settlement between these two sides in the little sliver of land that we both call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Hanan. Noor, thank you.
So,
Hi.
okay, so I think that Yossi and Rav Hanan talked a lot about the philosophy and deep thinking of roots and the work that we have been doing now for a couple of years. So I don't want to be repeating things. I just want to tell you that I'm one of the activists at Roots. I joined Roots actually in 2016, about 5 years ago. And my family are originally from the area of Jerusalem, from a village near Jerusalem called Malha. So they are refugees from 1948. I was born in Jordan. My family had the high hope in the Oslo peace process, that the Oslo peace process is going to bring us a solution and end of occupation. That didn't happen in 2000. Instead, we end up with more occupation and more frustration. And I grew up during the Second Intifada, during the time when the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, in some sense, like what Yossi said, there was this huge level of frustration between both sides, I would say. I want to make sure that you have enough time for a question. So I want to go to the very end of my story and explain how did I come to Roots. And I am a tour guide. I work mostly in the West Bank. I live in Bethlehem. And in 2016, I was hired to guide a group of students, of American students. In 2016, I had been now guiding for 2 years, geopolitical tours all around the West Bank, mostly in Bethlehem. And I was asked to take this group to the city of Hebron. And I remember that day I took the group and I was supposed to show them around, and this is what I did. We met with also Palestinians who are living there in Hebron, with Palestinian families, and they heard from us about the reality, about the occupation, about what we go through as Palestinians, what we are living. They heard from me about the facts, about the situation. And at the end of their tour, or at the end of the visit to Hebron, we were supposed to meet with a settler who is going to represent the Israeli settler community in Hebron. Now, I didn't do that much. I didn't do meetings like this before. I mean, my groups met with Palestinian speakers. They met with Israeli speakers, not when they were with me, but this was one of the first times that I actually get the chance, or that my groups meet with an Israeli speaker, and not just any Israeli, but an Israeli settler who lives in Hebron. When it happened before, I had to hand over my group when they go inside the settlement in Hebron, and I wait outside at the checkpoint. I will not be allowed to enter as a Palestinian. But this time, with that group that I'm talking about, actually, the speaker insisted that I should join and I should be part of this meeting. And I remember we sat somewhere, and then he started to talk to us. The settler, the speaker, was an American Jew who lived in the States and had a good life there. And he decided to give up on that life to come here to live in the land, and not anywhere in the land of Israel or in the state of Israel. He wanted to live in the heart of the occupied territories in Hebron. And then he started to tell us more about his story, but he wanted to leave my group with two main ideas. The first idea, he said, there is no occupation. We are not occupiers. We, as the Jewish people, we came back to this land, and there is no way that we can be considered occupiers. And it was the first time ever in my life that I hear someone denies the occupation. And I couldn't really understand what he's talking about. How can you deny something that's very obvious? I'm not saying it's occupation just because I'm a Palestinian. It's a military control over a civil population. And your military is controlling us, and that's the occupation. And then the second idea he said to my group was there is no Palestinian people. And this denial, this language of denial continued, but I wasn't really getting shocked by what he is saying, because I was kind of expecting from him saying these things, because this is what I know about the other side. They are all about denying us, and they are all about doing a crime against us and denying this crime. And when he says that, or when he said that he's a Zionist, yes, this is what the Zionist ideology is about. It's not, we don't learn about it, or we don't see it or experience it as a national movement of the Jewish people. We experience it as a denial, as a way of denying our connection and erasing our presence on this land. So I wasn't shocked, but I left Hebron feeling that day a lot of denial and anger and frustration, because it's one thing to read about these things in a book or some sort of a statement, but when you meet someone, a human being, to tell you these things in your face, that's a different thing. And on the way back to Bethlehem, I was supposed to go to Roots. Honestly, I didn't know what Roots is. I didn't really get it. I thought we are meeting with Rav Hanan, the same Rav Hanan we have with us tonight. And I thought he's just a settler from the Gush Etzion area who's going to talk. There will be a second speaker who's going to talk about the life in Gush Etzion. And it turned out to be that no, he's a member of an initiative called Roots, and they bring Palestinians and Israeli settlers together to talk about peace. And the first time I heard that, I was very angry with what I'm hearing. What do you mean Palestinians sitting with settlers? The first thing I thought, this is completely wrong. This is awful. These Palestinians are legitimizing the settlers and the settlement movement by doing this. They are legitimizing crimes and the occupation, I said to myself. And I came to Roots and I wanted to meet these Palestinians and ask them how dare they do what they are doing. In addition to that, I didn't even believe in most of what's called peace organizations or people who are working to reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I thought of them as people who are naive. They don't see the situation. They don't understand it. Trying to just make peace. We need to end the occupation. That's what I was saying. That's what I was thinking. And I came to Roots that day and I heard Rav Hanan's story, the full story, 45 minutes. And my group asked the questions. And at the end of his story, I was very challenged and overwhelmed and thinking a lot about the things that he said, about his story, about his identity, but also about the process that he told us to come to meet Palestinians and to meet his neighbors and to start to think about it and asking himself questions about very fundamental beliefs that he had about who he is and what his presence on this land affecting us. And I left Roots that day still thinking about what I just heard and encountered. And I thought about it for a couple of days and I decided to go back. But I left Roots that day, unlike Hebron, where I left with this sense of denial and anger. I left the talk with Hanan with a lot of the sense of recognition and empathy, that I was recognized and I was seen and I was more than that empathized with. So I asked myself this question: can I do the same? Can I return this back? Can I do the same thing to Rav Hanan? And I still remembered his words about fitting two truths into one heart, and that truth exists on all sides, and that falsehood is a truth masquerading as full truth, as the complete and the only truth. And I went back and I met with Ali and Shaul and Myron and the rest of the Roots activists, and I decided to join. And I decided to join. There is something that Yossi said at some point in his presentation about how politicians and diplomats dealing with this conflict with the tangibles and trying to solve it through the tangibles. And I do suffer from the tangible things, from the occupation, from the settlements, from lack of borders and lack of freedom and all of that. But I do believe deeply that our conflict is because of our identities and who we are and things that are intangible. That's what I believe, and that's what I saw at Roots. And that's why I decided to join. So yeah, that's how I see myself at Roots. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Noor. So I'm happy to open up now for a question. Anyone. I know we have about 20 minutes left. I want to see the summary. As we say, we've heard, I think Noor and Hanan talked about, in a sense, this levels of identity and the discourse that's being created at Roots. Roots work on the ground is about, in a sense, one part is challenging our societies with that discourse. In the last year, over 2,500 young Israelis, before they go to the army, came to Roots for a seminar. And there, many of them heard for the first time a Palestinian like Noor or Khalid or Iyad telling them their personal story and also telling them what it means, their national story. And to get that sense of challenge before they enlist is something that Roots is doing constantly. The people-to-people work is a big part of Roots, things like that. But also the advocacy, the solidarity, that means visiting victims of violence, Palestinians who suffered from price tag or self extremist attacks or Israelis attacked by Palestinians, showing up. Advocacy. You can see our WhatsApp groups are full of Israelis, settlers dealing with Palestinian land rights issues, trying to stop house demolitions, trying to engage, trying to affect army policies, trying to climb that ladder of find local rabbinical leadership or Muslim leadership who are willing to take another stand in how they teach our people about who the other is. And growth, and this model of local work to attach and address these larger issues. Tomorrow night between Nablus and Ariel in the Samaria region, the northern West Bank, you have Roots' third chapter. It's meeting after 2 years of building there and constant meetings growing. In the Jordan Valley, we have both student groups, we have weekly cleanups at local springs, all this kind of work to bring local people engaged and set up these local associations to challenge and to build partnership. That's a bit what we're doing. And obviously Roots is at a really poised for a lot of growth right now. I'm going to open for questions now, but if people are interested in supporting, learning more, I'm going to post a link. In the United States, we have a Friends of Roots. It's a 501c. People like Bria and other Americans and Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the United States supporting our work. We're grateful for every bit that helps to further this project. I'm going to post LinkedIn now and also move to questions in here from anybody. Please, I'll put up our Facebook page too. Follow me too. And I can't see all the hand. I'm trying to look. Thank God, we're a lot of people here. If anybody, feel free to post a question there, or to just raise the hand. Ruth, the Zoom hand. Michael, yeah, please.
Noor, thank you very much. Both Rav Hanan and Noor, thank you very much for your stories. Very inspirational. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Noor, maybe it's because I'm an American Jew, but I feel as if you are facing an uphill battle. What I mean by that is, how are you finding the reception of your opening of your mind and your beliefs to recognition of both truths? How are you finding that resonating with your peers, with Palestinians who you're engaging with on a regular basis? I think that the work you're doing is tremendous, and I really appreciate it. But I'm just curious to see how is it being received by your fellow Palestinians?
Thank you for the question. I think most people around me, when I tell them about Roots, they react. They react to it the same way I reacted to it the first time I heard about it. They are shocked, and they are confused, and the terminology itself. Like, if I use the term settlers, the word settler is very loaded, and it has very negative connotations, and they think that I'm doing completely a wrong thing. When I joined, I had people who stopped talking to me and didn't want to interact with me in any way because of what I'm doing. And on the other hand, I had people who didn't need so much to convince them, that didn't need that much effort to convince them to come and join the Roots activities. But in general, most of the people around me are skeptical about it, are not really sure what the intentions of my partners are. Like, they feel suspicious about it. They see that many people don't see the problem with individuals, with Israeli individuals or Israeli people as people, but as with the government, with the occupation, with the policies that the government make, and that's their issue with. So they will tell me, yeah, you find some few nice people on the other side, but look at what the government is, look what the occupation is doing, look what the other day they said, and that's how people around me react. Of course, when we publicize about Roots on the Palestinian side, we try to go carefully and be aware. We choose we try to choose the right time in order to publish things and to speak out, or to talk about Roots and about the events that we do. And I think sometimes I'm careful too much I think that sometimes we are being careful too much, like we are hold ourselves because we don't want to risk. Other Palestinians at Roots have a different opinion. They think that sometimes we are being too public or too confrontative. And I think this way because there are many times that I feel like there are people that I want to invite to Roots, but I don't. And then I find them there at Roots. They heard about it from other people and they came to it. And they come with a sense of curiosity. They want to see what Roots is offering. And even if they don't necessarily agree with our vision, our way, it would still be important for them, I mean, for Palestinians from my society, to get to know Israelis and to know them personally. Also, it might be an opportunity for a job, for improving their lives in a way. So that's how most people around me react to what we are doing.
Thank you very much, and I both admire and appreciate your courage. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question there above, which maybe was for Yossi. It asked about, is your goal ultimately a two-state solution? There's a question a lot of groups ask, obviously, in terms of Roots is civil society, it's grassroots work, but what about politics? If Hanan or Noor want to reflect a little bit about that.
I'll say something about it. So the question is your goal ultimately a two-state solution? The answer is not exactly. Roots doesn't have a particular political plan as our goal, but we do have a general vision, and part of that vision is political. Our general vision says that we envision a new social and political reality that recognizes both sides' historical connection and belonging to the whole land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and grants dignity, equality, and human rights to both sides. So that's a general vision that we're working towards. How would this vision be put into political reality? How would it be applied? So Roots doesn't say, and there are a number of different ways. If we're pushed and we're asked, okay, Hanan, as an individual, do you have a particular political vision, a plan? Yes, I do. And I think that many members in Roots share what I'm about to say. There is a political or a political social movement in Israel and Palestine called the Land for All. And they put forth a political program called Two States, One Homeland. And many of us in Roots, although not all of us, see their particular political plan as a very, very plausible way to put into practice the values and the general vision that Roots is working towards. Before I put on the table what their particular political plan is, I want to put on the table the paradox that their plan speaks to. The paradox is the following. As far as Palestinian identity goes, the whole land from the river to the sea is Palestine. As far as traditional Jewish identity goes, the whole land from the river to the sea is Israel. So in other words, any particular political plan has to give the whole land to the Palestinians and also has to give the whole land to the Jews. That sounds impossible, except if you have a one-state solution. So you give the whole land to both sides. But no, not a one-state solution. Why? Because the other side of the paradox is that Jewish identity, at least modern Jewish identity, as I understand it, requires that there be a particularly Jewish state, a state of Jewish culture, Jewish sovereignty, Jewish values, and with a majority of Jewish people. And at the same time, most Palestinians, although not a overwhelming majority believe there should be a Palestinian state, a particular Palestinian state with a Palestinian character. So here's the paradox. You have to give both sides the whole land, but you have to give both sides also their own particular state. How do you do that? How do you square the circle? How do you solve these two contradictory principles of giving both sides the whole land, but also giving both sides their own particular piece of the land? How do you solve that? So the Land for All program actually does solve that. And the way they solve that is through the creation of two states, Israel and Palestine, with more or less the 1948 line, the 1967 line, what we call the Green Line, between them. Two states, but not two separate states, but rather two intertwined states. That's the point. Not two separate states, but two intertwined states. And the intertwining may be accomplished on at least three levels. Open borders, open residency, and confederation. I'll explain each of them. Open borders means that there's a border on the map, there's a border on the ground, but in most cases you can pass from one side to the other without being obstructed. Number two, open residency, meaning you can live your whole life, you can reside your whole life on the other side of the border. Explanation, you can be an Israeli Jew whose state is Israel, but you can live the whole life in the state of Palestine without getting Palestinian citizenship, just on the basis of your Israeli citizenship. Meaning that I, as a Jew, can live in Hebron, or in Alon Shvut, Gush Etzion, Ramallah, Shechem, Beit El, as an Israeli citizen. And Palestinians with Palestinian citizenship can live their whole life in Israel, in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or in Ashdod, without getting Israeli citizenship. Now this principle I just put on the table of open residency immediately solves so many problems, that Palestinian refugees can come back. They won't accept the demographic balance in Israel because they won't be Israeli citizens, they'll be Palestinian citizens. And Israeli settlers can stay in Judea and Samaria as Israeli citizens without being Palestinian citizens. And after we talked about open borders and open residency, the third principle, as I said, is confederation, that these two states, with their own sovereignty, their own flag, their own organs of government, come together in a confederation, perhaps similar to the European Union, that has its own organs of government. And it creates a union of the two states, Israel and Palestine. Now what this does, these three levels of intertwining, open borders, open residency, and confederation, what they do is they square the circle. At the same time that each side has its state and its identity that requires national expression of the identity is satisfied, but also the intertwining gives both sides the sense that they got enough of a connection to the whole land, to the whole cake, that their identities have not been contradicted and nullified. It seems to me and to many of us in Roots that this plan is really a very viable way to put into practice the ideals and the visions that we in Roots are educating towards. The problem is that it's impossible pipe dream. And it's impossible pipe dream because it requires trust. It requires recognition, deep recognition of the side's identity and belonging. And that goes back to everything we've been talking about. The Roots is working on establishing that type of human recognition of the other side's narrative, identity, and belonging to the land.
Thank you, Khan. I know we're about to the end of our time. And that parallel between grassroots work, which we call civil responsibility, working with inner societies, as a complement to political initiatives, is exactly how Roots fits into this larger work. And I think you'll find Hanan and Noor is very involved now with the Palestinian Directorate of Land for All and their work in bringing those ideas to the ground. And part of that exporting discourse is participating in the kind of rethinking and reimagining peace that actually a lot of the core Roots members are participants of a lot of other organizations and kind of new initiatives. And it's also something we obviously bring to our societies in our programs and the people coming to visit us. If we have time for one more question there, and maybe not. No, I want to pass on to Bria to close and thank everybody for coming out and being here together, sitting on the screen. And I'm going to post up an email address for myself. Please feel free to follow up with any questions or ideas. If you're coming to visit Israel, Palestine, interested in visiting and seeing projects on the ground, we're welcome to hosting and need a tour guide, I highly recommend Noor. Pass on to Bria. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaul. I want to begin by thanking Noor and Hanan and Yossi and Shaul for a really wonderful, inspiring, educational morning. I want to thank the 5 synagogues in Seattle that have co-sponsored this program: Congregation Ezra B'Sarot, Sephardic Bikur Cholim, Congregation Beth Shalom, Conservative Congregation Herzl Ner Tamid, and Temple de Hirsch Sinai. It was a great coming together of synagogues in Seattle. We're very far away from Israel and Palestine here in Seattle, but we're very close to Israel and Palestine here in Seattle. Seattle Friends of Roots has 2 missions. One is to educate ourselves in the kind of program that we had today and in the kind of programs that are available to you through Roots. But our other mission is to financially support this unique, inspirational, important work. And I want to ask you today to be generous and to use the links that Shaul has put onto the screen to make large and small, whatever you can do, donations to Friends of Roots. We want to be part of creating this holy place, this place of dignity for Israelis and Palestinians, for Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims and Christians, right there, right there. Thank you so much. Did I miss anything, Shaul?
No, thank you, Bria. And I also just want to share that I think the work here, like you said, Roots is here in Seattle. We host a lot of campus groups, a lot of young Israelis and Palestinians, other people, Muslims, Jews around the world. There's a lot to do on the ground. And thank you for, I think, Yossi's message of how this culture of engagement across divide is something important to share. And so blessing you, all the luck in the local issues, the local challenges as well, as we all walk together. So shalom. On the biggest level, shalom.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Toda rabba. Toda. Bye.